But first, after a week of bleeding, the government confirmed this afternoon that it's breaking its pre-election promise there would not be any changes to super, with the new announcement that from 2025, superannuation balances over $3 million would pay higher tax on fund earnings. Now, just like John Howard with the GST in 1998, Anthony Albanese is hoping that by breaking his election promise, but with the change only to come into effect after the next election, 2025, that somehow that makes it less of a breach of faith. Now, I doubt it'll wash with voters, especially as there are clearly more broken promises in the pipeline. And this one in particular on super looks very much like a premeditated tactic from Labor. Now, premeditated in the sense they knew they would do this all the way along. It's just that they decided it was less pain to wear the broken promise after a win than to tell the people before the election, before they voted, and risk losing the election as they did under Bill Shorten. You'd remember Bill Shorten lost the unlosable election in 2019 because of an effective campaign against Labor's big attacks on retirees and investors, plus a campaign against their price inflating and job destroying energy policy. And clearly the Shorten campaign experience changed how Labor played things last May. Don't promise anything that might upset anyone was clearly the lesson. But once you're in government, as Peter Garrett once said, don't worry, you can change everything. And that's because in government, you've got all the resources of incumbency to soften up the electorate and intimidate opponents in the hope your broken promise gets forgiven or forgotten. It's an incredibly cynical political tactic, especially as it's now clear that it'll be deployed for further tax increases that was specifically ruled out pre-election. Treasurer Jim Chalmers has spent the last week justifying Labor's impending broken promise on super on the grounds that millionaires, he says, don't need tax breaks. Today, the government was at pains to state that 99% of superannuation balances would be unaffected and that this fairness measure would raise some $2 billion a year to fund spending on NDIS and other so-called fairness benefits. It's just that also today, the government released figures for the claimed cost of various other so-called tax concessions for the rich. And clearly, the government will now be looking at all of them to fill a $50 billion a year structural deficit. Today's data claim that capital gains tax discounts cost the budget $26 billion a year and that negative gearing costs nearly $4 billion a year, with most of the benefits, we're told by the government, going to the so-called rich. It was claimed today that 68% of the $17 billion a year claimed in franking credits went to the top 10% of taxpayers. So expect the removal of concessions here too. More broken promises that they will try and say aren't really broken promises because they will start only after the next election. So why did Labor do it? Well, in part, it improves the out years of the forward estimates. So the budget numbers look better on budget night for Jim Chalmers than they really are. And second, because this is the first real salvo playing up to the Labor left in Labor's new class war against the so-called rich. But the reality is, if Labor is after the top 10% of earners in this country, if that's Labor's definition of rich, then does it surprise you to know that the top 10% of earners in this country is anyone earning $130,000 a year or more? $130,000, yes, it's a good wage, but it's not rich, not if you live in a capital city. And worse than that, $130,000 a year is a sort of wage that many Australians would see as aspirational, one they might hope themselves to earn one day, or with a good education or a trade, a wage for their kids one day. That's a problem with a class war. It hurts aspiration, and once it gets started, it hurts our country too.